give, the person takes a joint after the kids go to bed before he goes to sleep or she goes to sleep, and then also when they wake up in the morning. I think it's what happens during the time between those two data points as to how he has to interact with those kids. That to me could be the concern.
Like what?
Like he gets up in the morning and takes his kids to school.
So you're again talking about the driving?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what about getting up, feeding him breakfast, getting him dressed, helping
Well, no, I don't think he's going to become delusional and give him Drano. No.
Okay.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't envy any of the people that have to make these evaluations because they see so many of them, they're just black and white kind of things. And I understand where you're coming from. But unfortunately, I just see the narratives where it really, you know, you go off the end of the cliff kind of a thing. On the other hand, when you start dealing with things like meth and stuff, then you can become agitated and irritated and you know, aggressive and potentially violent. So even though you get a nice positive high and you get this euphoria, sense of well-being, and it's a great sexual stimulant, that ain't going to do it in a parental environment.
We've been talking about how it affects people in terms of impairment. What about people who are pregnant, having children? Is there any scientific evidence that the use of THC causes any type of impairment on the fetus?
Well, I'm trying to think of the author. There are. I'm not aware of fetal abnormalities with THC, but I honestly, you could become an instant toxicologist with THC and fetal implications because there's hundreds of articles and symposium that deal with that. I don't know what the bottom line is.
What do you mean when you say implications?
Well, the use of the drug and monitoring fetal development over time. I mean, there are a lot of places where a person's going to use it anyway, and there are studies that can look at indices and growth rates and sonograms and all that other stuff to see is there a greater incident of hydrocephaly or something else.
Is there?
No, I'm not aware of it, no. Yes, ma'am.
A question about the alcohol testing, because you had alluded to the fact that urine samples were not a good way to get an alcohol. But we have people, that's the only testing they use for our clients. So a lot of times you'll have a person, for instance, who's in a drug program, and they'll be testing clean for drugs, but they'll pop dirty for alcohol. And the assumption is that because alcohol leaves your system so quickly that if you're testing positive for alcohol in your urine, that must mean that they're drinking. We also get people telling us, well, I took NyQuil.
Well, NyQuil is 10% alcohol. And once it gets in the body has no clue where it came from, a beer, wine, or
what's the
tequila.
likelihood that somebody, I mean, if somebody's testing at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon and they test dirty for alcohol, is it likely that they were drinking that day or the night before?
Well, the only most common non-related alcohol ingestion is the incidence of a person having a bacterial infection and spilling glucose into the urine, and the bugs eat the urine, eat the glucose and convert it to ethanol. That's a common thing that happens. So if a person had an infection, and it was your brother or whatever, and you know he's telling you the truth, then that could be an explanation.
Or if they're diabetic, right?
Well, yeah. Well, you could have. The same thing could hold true if you're diabetic and you're spilling glucose, and if you had an infection. The glucose in and of itself doesn't break down to ethanol.
But
Okay.
if it's showing up in urine, like how recent would that alcohol use likely?
You mean if
So
it's
would
due
they
to
try-
ethanol?
Yeah.
Well, again, the body eliminates it at 0.02 per hour. So one standard drink, which is about 0.6 of a fluid ounce of ethanol, could get metabolized to CO2 in water. But some of it is because the urine is an ultrafiltrate of the blood. It can happen. But again, not to overstate, but it's just extremely hard to equate a urine result with an acceptable blood equivalent to talk about, well, yeah, he must have had 2 beers or or this amount of alcohol 2 hours before to have this kind of level in his urine. That's not easy to do. But there can be explanations that are unrelated to consumption of alcoholic beverages.
Can you just, is it possible for people to just use meth recreationally without becoming addicted? I had heard something like,
Methamphetamine?
yes,
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, you can. Again, what did Paracelsus say? It's due to the dose. I mean, I know people, for example, a woman whose parents comes to visit every quarter. She takes a Dex to stay up all night to clean the house because she knows when these in-laws come, she doesn't want them to see the way her house is normal. So she does that and she's fine. Or the truck driver, you know, that wants to make a long whatever. But if you get the so-called rush or high, and that is appealing to you, meth is probably the most fastest addiction that you can get.
that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
And just very briefly, that flushing and pH levels as red flags when people are testing. Could you speak to that?
I'm sorry.
Testing, flushing, and then pH levels as red
Well,
flags.
Well, the reason pH is of a concern is because in this case, for example, most of the drugs that you get in your urine are basic drugs. So if you can add some sort of a urinary acidifier that creates a salt, it hastens the elimination of the drug. Now, on one hand, that's sort of good for the person because they perceive they're getting rid of it faster. On the other hand, if they get called just after they've started that, they're going to have more of it in their urine than they would normally because it's being flushed out. So you can adjust pH and hasten or retard the elimination of the drug. When you say flushing in this sense, are you
Things you can buy on the internet to take to dilute the
well,
drug.
well, there's all kinds of there's all kinds of things that they claim will eliminate a positive result. What they ultimately are saying, though, about 9 out of 10 are merely only that they you can make an argument that there are other things that can cause that positivity based on what you're using. But as soon as you go to a confirmatory test, then you remove all doubt. I mean, it is what it is.
So in the preliminary test, there can be red flags.
Yeah, and using something like methamphetamine, which is probably the most common one, there are so many phenethylamines or decongestants, Sudafed, phenyltoloxamine, phenylpropanolamine. Those are all drugs that have a phenylethylamine that look just like amphetamines and will give a positive. But once you take it to the next step and do the confirmatory test, if it's only Sudafed, that's what's going to be seen, and there's no meth and there's no amp. So you have that. But it's very important that you move along and ask them what kinds of things are taken. A lot of times, especially in Hispanics, you hear about these herbal preparations. And it is true that some of these herbal preparations that comes from Mexico do have meth laced. Now, it's hard for me to believe that a person could be taking this and being stimulated and not know something's wrong. I mean, it's not like you feel the same way. But yeah, there could be an illicit use of them by some adulterant. Yes.
Just getting back to the marijuana and the effects of children really quickly, is there any scientific evidence that secondhand smoke causes any type of effect on the child's brain development?
No. I don't think the levels are ever going to get to any appreciable level where it causes developmental problems.
And how about for children who are nursing?
Well, that's a little bit different, and because then you're moving directly the THC from the mother's milk into the individual. And there are studies that demonstrate kids can have significant levels and subsequent sequelae.
How long does PACTOX keep a sample so that a confirmatory test can be done? Because what we get is just the initial test. When we get our reports, we would have to ask for a confirmatory test. Sometimes that's easier to do than other times.
Unless the contract with Child and Family Services only gives you the screening test. I don't think that's the case. I thought you would always get a confirmed test.
Not
I mean-
that that's
I
where.
wanted to ask, because I've been told different things
Yeah.
on the test. If you get a positive, right,
Yeah.
that's on the screen, and it says at the top, like, if there's a positive, there will be like a GS.
GCMS
Yeah,
automatic
GCMS.
confirmation.
Is that done automatically, and that's the result that you get at the bottom, or should there be
Yes,
another
yes. No,
something that counts?
We were told it, like she said, it does it, but on the test it says screen, right?
well, they do the screen. That's because the test itself is composed of two components. One is the screening, and it lists all of them, and it'll say screen negative for cocaine, PCP, positive for amphetamines. Then you go down below, and it says confirmation, methamphetamine, X number of nanograms, amphetamine, Y number of nanograms.
Oh.
So if you get a number, that's the confirmation test,
Yeah.
right?
But there are tests, there's amphetamines that are street drugs and there are amphetamines that are prescription drugs. And,
No, well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, go ahead.
But no, the fact of the matter is, a person could have a positive response for methamphetamine because he or she takes the drug. And in the results, you would never know whether it's due to medicinal use or recreational use.
Okay,
I mean, to the instrument and everything, it's just meth.
and I'm not talking about meth.
Oh,
Because
okay.
you can just have a positive test for amphetamine.
Yes,
That's what I'm talking about.
yes.
So, you don't know, can't you do further testing? Like you just said, the second test could confirm whether it's Sudafed or whether it's this one. We don't get that.
No, but you would never get, unless I'm wrong, and you could check with Jeff, but to get a positive screening test means that they go to the next step for the confirmation. And let's just say they do the confirmation, it's not meth, and it's not amphetamine. They would report that level out as negative.
Okay. I see.
So then if it is a positive for amphetamine and so many NGs, then it's amphetamine. It couldn't be Sudafed or something like that.
Well, if the screening test is initially positive, that's all it says. It doesn't say how many nanograms or whatever.
Right.
It just says it exceeded the cutoff.
Right.
That's what it implies. Then they go back and they take a separate aliquot of the urine, put it through the GC mass spec, and there the separation comes into play. And now they particularly can tell you what's the causation of it.
And if it was Sudafed, it would just test 0. It wouldn't say Sudafed or something like that. It would just
No, if it was basically, well, if it was Sudafed plus meth plus whatever, they would probably just list the meth and the amp, because that's what they report. If they did the test and it was only Sudafed, it's my opinion they would go back up and the result report that you would get would be negative. Because you're not testing for the presence of other phenethylamines in this amphetamine sample. You're testing primarily either for methamphetamine, amphetamine, methylene dioxy, methamphetamine, ecstasy, or whatever.
So we get a meth test that comes back and it's above the cutoff, but like right above the cutoff. And our client is saying, no, well, I took Sudafed because I was sick and, you know, I might have taken too much Sudafed. Is that going to be accurate? I mean, is it
Well, no, you need
Sudafed
to,
that's
well,
causing
what
you to-
I would do in that case is, I mean, you could call me to investigate it, but you don't need to do that. I would call the lab, give them the specimen number. Now, the problem with calling the lab, see, is that DCFS actually is their client. So it's a little hard to have you interact when you're not their client. But you can do that. You can just say, I'm with Ladle and I have this result and my client indicates she was using such and such. Could you please look at the chromatogram and tell me whether or not this specimen had methamphetamine in it? And I would just assume that that report should tell you that.
I've heard, the only thing I've heard, and this is, I'm sure you can debunk this, but that could cause a meth test that could be even remotely something that could be appropriately used is a Vicks inhaler. I've always heard the Vicks inhaler.
Well, that's what I just said.
Okay, so
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I said one of the things you can take is a Vicks inhaler, which is the methamphetamine. Now that sounds really good, right? But what what I was going to share with you as a chemist is methamphetamine exists in two forms. A D-isomer, which is the stimulant isomer. That's what you do when you take it illicitly or you take it as a central nervous system stimulant. The L-isomer, which is a vasoconstrictor, and it's used when you got runny nose and rhinitis and you put the Vicks inhaler up your nose and you do this, and it causes the capillaries to constrict, and so therefore you don't have the same runny nose. To the instrument, if you did that and the L-methamphetamine was in your circulatory system and ultimately formed in your urine, the screening test and the initial test can't tell the difference. So it would come positive for methamphetamine at X amount. Now what you do is, you say, well, my client has been using Vicks. They go back, because they keep the sample for a year. Okay? And you go back, you take another aliquot, and you ask them to do a DL isomer, which they will do at no charge. There's a separate chromatographic procedure that can separate a D from an L. And in order for it to be an L isomer, the L isomer would have to be, I think, 80% of the total meth component.
Will misuse of the Vicks inhaler create that, or it?
Well, yeah. Well, I would
Just
tell you this.
regular use.
No, I am a frustrated comedian. Okay, so I always use the hyperbole. But I mean, if you stuck 2 Vicks inhalers up your nose and walked around the house all day long, maybe you could get a level that might do that. But it has been shown to do that.
Okay.
But you see what happens. These people, they go to the internet. And they say, what causes a false meth? A Vicks inhaler. Well, I've been doing that. I mean, same thing with alcohol. Well, I use Robitussin AC or whatever. But in order to get that 0.12, you would have to have consumed 2 bottles of the Robitussin AC. Now, that is not to say that there's sometimes not legitimate reasons that that alternative is true and should be used to properly vindicate. I'm not making it all as if it's 2% of the cases. But in the case of the L-amphetamine, what I'm saying is you can have that test done, and if indeed there was L-methamphetamine, they will tell you. And that would be a very important thing for you to indicate to the judge, if that was the case. Yes, sir?
So earlier, I think you said that a urine sample for alcohol is just not a good way to go back and pinpoint when someone had a certain number of drinks. Is that an accurate reading?
Well, but yes.
Or more specifically, when we get a positive test for urine sample for alcohol, and let's just throw out the bacteria explanation, what can we reasonably infer from that? That the client drank alcohol at some point prior to the test, or, I mean?
Well, I mean, if indeed you're eliminating other causal relationships, and again, the alcohol is done, well, again, you would have to, again, there's a screening test for the urine test that's enzymatic, that's alcohol dehydrogenase, and it gives a positive. I think if they got that as a positive, they would take a step back, take another aliquot, and do it on a gas chromatograph. Then they'll see ethanol. Now, once they do that, and assuming that's your client's urine sample, then the only conclusion you could come up with is, in the absence of any other point, then that represents ethanol. When that person used the ethanol, in terms of trying to put a timeline to it, would be very hard to do.
So let's say I got a result that said, because I think it comes with the numericals like a 0.05.
Yeah.
That basically, that doesn't really tell me that much.
Well, and the last thing you want to do, and the judge may, you don't equate a 0.05 urine result to a 0.05 blood result.
Okay.
Under no circumstances.
And does Pactox have a way of distinguishing bacteria at all? Do they test for that, or do you have to go to a doctor? Or?
Well, you can have the test checked for that.
But that's not
for
automatic,
bacteria.
is
That's not what they normally do. I'm sure there's an extra charge for that, yeah. Because that's not part of the original test code for that drug.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
This was a question that I was requested to ask, so I'm sorry if it doesn't make much sense.
I need to get that person's address because I have to send them the invoice.
All right, I'll get it to you. Is there science yet to track the ingestion of spice And what is the legality and medical science we should know about?
Well, I was gonna have a couple of slides devoted to spice, but I didn't get around to it. And spice, as you know, are synthetic sort of cannabinoids that are around. And there is some, and they can be tested for. And there is some good science relating to the signs and symptoms associated with spice use. So if a person has an index that they think spice, now again, you don't, you can't wait till multiple months later and then want to have a sample, you know. And the other point that I just wanted to say that's related to this is this hair testing. Because somebody will say they got a urine result and they got it positive for meth. Then they went out and did a hair follicle testing and it was negative. And they say, well, it also checks for 3 months out or whatever. But hair follicle testing or hair testing in general is when you're trying to observe chronic use over a longer period of time than what you could assess in a typical urine sample. Okay? But to try to say on February the 9th, this person used meth, and we did a hair follicle testing, and it's negative, proves they didn't use, you can't do that, okay? And that's just a helpful hint from Heloise. I mean, it has a useful purpose, but in general, it's to denote chronicity over a longer period of time, which you could not do with a blood sample or a urine sample.
Well, that's what we like to do with our hair follicle test, is to say that.
Oh, I know what you like to do. Believe me, I do, and I'm not saying ultimately you couldn't if you can get the judge, because I think, no disrespect to judges, but a lot of them have not been steeped in toxicology either. And so, sometimes when I go testify, they just say, I want you to come and explain this. Is this a possible option? I mean, I testify for the prosecution and the defense. The science doesn't change, but it's how you use that as if to make it dogmatically. And many times you cannot say with scientific certainty that the person was either impaired or incapable of taking care of a child or whatever, based on the information that you have. And sometimes maybe the judge needs to hear that, because everybody likes to be dogmatic. And certainly on the prosecution side, the criminalist wants to say everything is a post-absorption elimination of the alcohol, and you just keep adding alcohol back when he or she doesn't know when they even started or when they stopped, that kind of thing. Okay. I hope you got a little something out of this, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
The slides will be available.